This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Ludicrous speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
Hello, and welcome everyone to another amazing episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. It's your girl BK, and with me is my amazing co-host, Jack Manley. How you doing, Jack?
I'm doing well, BK. I am very interested to see how today is going to go because we are in some uncharted waters for yours truly, though I take it we're going into some territory that you are intimately familiar with in the world of film.
Yes, indeed. And for those of you who are listening, we are going to be diving into the world of musical theater today, and I am so excited to talk about it.
That is right. We are going to be taking a look at the 2021 film Tick, Tick, Boom, directed by Lin-Manuel Miranda with a screenplay by Steven Levinson. And BK, this is intimately based on the life and work of the songwriter Jonathan Larson, who I take it is kind of a hero of yours.
Oh, yes, a hero, an inspiration, a pillar, if you will, in my artist background. He is one of the most amazing musical theater composers I have ever been honored to listen to their music of. Unfortunately, he did not live a very long life here, but it was a very fantastic life he did live. And he left us with some phenomenal pieces of work in artistry. And we are checking out, I think, the one that is most intimate to him when we're starting with Tick, Tick, Boom. So I'm quite literally so excited to be able to bring this to the podcast. He was someone who told real stories about real people and really changed the musical theater industry. So to be able to bring, I think, our second musical work here to the podcast, Jack, I am honored that this is the film we're going to be doing.
Our first musical was kind of a subversive under the radar one, which is kind of how I like my musicals. We're talking about All That Jazz from 1979, Bob Fosse's film. And the music is kind of incidental to it. It's much more about the human drama and the way that the music emboldens that as a dramatic film first. But this is, I guess, the first out-and-out musical. And it's a very interesting pick by you. But I need you to clear something up for me because ever since I saw it end up on the schedule, I've been wondering something that I need you to clear up for me. I don't know a lot about Jonathan Larson, but I know that Jonathan Larson is responsible for Rent. And I know that Rent is this monumental landmark show in the history of musical theater. And so I'm sitting there week after week looking at the schedule and I'm just thinking to myself, why aren't we watching Rent? I know there is a great film adaptation of Rent. Why was that not on the schedule and Tick, Tick, Boom was?
I'm actually glad you asked. I really, really feel that it is integral to understand the person behind Rent and understand the story of Jonathan Larson and where he comes from his work. And Tick, Tick, Boom is an autobiographical musical. So I thought, what a better way to learn about the man behind the magic that is Rent by watching an amazing, phenomenal adaptation of one of his older previous works called Tick, Tick, Boom. I mean, watching this film, you're able to actually kind of see the life of Jonathan Larson as well as experience an amazing musical. But this all kind of came from his real life experiences. And I think that that's just why I really wanted to go with this first, was to bring us into Jonathan Larson, because once you have that context, let me tell you, Rent hits so different.
I will say it was surprising to see on the schedule, but more than that, when I actually watched it, I found it to be a very novel musical and a very novel kind of film. It is a biopic, and we're so used to, beginning with stuff like Walk the Line for the last 20 years, see very canned kind of formulaic biopics. This really eschewed that framework to give us something, I think, very interesting in the way that it looked at his life and the way that it celebrated his story in New York City as he worried about his career choices and he reckoned with his life as a starving artist. I think there was just a real resonance to that I found very interesting, and I thought it was cool to see it told in such a unique way. So I'm really glad that we got to look at this, and more to it, the film gives us, I think, kind of a nice little yellow brick road, if you will, in front of us for the history behind this, because the history of this show really is the history of Jonathan Larson, it seems.
Oh, 100%. I mean, Tick, Tick, Boom is based on the autobiographical musical by Jonathan Larson, and it's the story of him, an aspiring composer in New York City, who's worried that they made the wrong career choice, which I can kind of really resonate with. As an artist here, I know, Jack, you can too. But, you know, that isn't just the one thing you're worrying about there. Jonathan Larson and the character Jonathan in the play navigates the pressures of love, friendship, very real emotions like anxiety as he's reaching the ripe age of 30 and is really trying to tackle the pressure of writing and becoming a composer for a truly successful musical, as he's currently workshopping his newest musical, Superbia. I love the fact that the plot of Tick, Tick, Boom is writing a musical in itself. Like, what a way to be meta. Now, I have to know that that type of a subject matter has to come from a musical theater nerd from birth. And let me tell you, Jack, Jonathan Larson was just that.
I just find it funny that we went from last week, where we were talking about a film by a filmmaker, where the narrative of the film was constructed largely around the music, and now we're talking about a play written by a guy from New York who largely conveys his emotions through music. The way we move from one piece to another in this season just continues to be eerie.
It's crazy. Like, you would think we super five-brain planned it, but honestly, this stuff starts to kind of unfold so organically. I mean, I was quite literally shocked finding out how important music was from the last episode that we had. So to kind of bring us into a musical for this episode was a unknown thread, but I'm glad it brought us here. And Jonathan Larson is definitely repping New York. We're 2 for 2, Jack. This man was born and raised off these streets, let me tell you.
When I looked him up, I saw that he was a Mount Vernon kid. And not only that, but his musical underpinnings, like you said, really start from a very, very young age. He performed as a trained classical musician and as a vocalist and as a performer all the way from basically from youth all the way through high school and into college at Adelphi University. And he was driven by some pretty powerful influences. Names like Stephen Sondheim, Elton John, The Doors, and The Who. So he had a very strong musical background leading him to university where, from what I understand, he basically had Superbia in mind while he was in college. This thing was his baby.
Yeah, Jonathan Larson was someone who really was good at having these concepts, having these ideas, and kind of constantly stewing on them and creating them. So when I started to learn the origins of his creation and the origins of his works, it was quite fascinating to kind of bring back to the very first thing that he tackled, or at least tried to get out into the world, and that is the musical Superbia that he made himself. I feel like that's such a crazy thing to think of. I can't imagine waking up one day in class or blinking my eyes and going, you know what? I'm going to make an entire musical. I don't know what type of person that takes, but it's definitely some tenacity that I don't know that I have.
Funnily enough, it wasn't even his first attempt at doing a musical at this young of an age, because he was basing this off of an earlier attempt he had tried to make to adapt the George Orwell novel 1984. Who would have thought that, of all things, 1984 would figure into this story?
I don't even know what the hell you're talking about. I didn't even realize there was some sort of reference material on Superbia. Or you mean to tell me that he based it off of some sort of like book adaptation?
Firstly, I'd like to congratulate you, BK, for being the first person in American history to be honest about the fact that they haven't read 1984.
I don't know what that is. Should I know what that is? Oh gosh, people are rolling in their chairs right now, aren't they, Space?
Well, no, it's an incredible landmark novel that I haven't read either, but it's seen as this meme now, basically, where the words George Orwell's 1984 are today kind of a stand-in for this idea of a dystopic authoritarian hell. So every dystopia both is and isn't 1984 by virtue of the way that people have and haven't interacted with the source material. But Larson had, and he was so struck by its themes that he wanted to be able to bring that into the musical form. But between being unable to get the rights to that source material and just the sheer labor of adapting it, he was disappointed, but said that ultimately the best thing that ever happened to him was not being able to do that, because that's what led him to Superbia.
Wow, I had no idea. I feel like I might have heard it once. I recognized the name, but I didn't know that that is the direct line to, dystopianism. That's definitely not the word, but
No. Dystopianism applies. A word that appropriately made up and ridiculous for a book that most of us haven't read and claim to have read is perfect.
But I love that. I feel like after watching Tick, Tick, Boom and getting little hints about this musical that he's working on, this super futuristic dystopian play in the film called Superbia, to find out that that is something that he actually worked on throughout his life and in college, and it becoming something, and that the story in the film is a real thing that happened, just stays blowing my mind the more I learn about it and learn about the process.
Well, he got lucky in that his college professors had a real faith in him to be able to engage with the work that he was trying to adapt. And they encouraged him to keep a lot of the material from the Orwell project in Superbia. And it was really through developing those ideas and that material at the ASCAP Musical Theater Workshop where it began to grow into what it was, which was a slightly fleshed out musical set in the year 2064 in a world inundated by TV cameras and news coverage that's meant to be a cautionary tale about media desensitization. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, BK, that's a little bit similar to a certain Terry Gilliam film we reviewed this season.
It does. It sounds very familiar. Pray tell, Jack, why are we making all of these connections?
Well, maybe because Terry Gilliam also read 1984. We all have to go our homework, everybody's homework, is to go read 1984 after this podcast.
No, I really think I will. I need to know now. I love being able to find out source material for projects, so I've given myself that homework assignment.
Ultimately, because like Gilliam's Brazil, Larson's Superbia was such an ambitious idea, it was pretty much impossible to produce. It had these story problems that we've been alluding to that were really too nebulous for Broadway to take on. Broadway needs fully fleshed, fully developed products that they can churn out the way that they do. But it was also far too expensive to produce in an off-Broadway way. But BK, the dirty secret was that even in Broadway theaters, they probably would not have been able to handle the modern pop rock concert sound design that Larson wanted and that was starting to come in vogue in the 1980s.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about it that way. The actual theaters were not equipped with like the updated sound systems in order to have a full-fledged like rock band there performing on top of performers and stagecraft. It's something that was never done before. So that makes so much sense.
It's interesting because the way that the technical world in Broadway was bumping up against this new generation and these new ideas was reflected in the way that Larson's script and Larson's idea of Superbia seemed to split the playwrights who assisted at the ASCAP workshop and would come in and critique the work of these young playwrights. Stephen Sondheim, on one hand, was an early supporter of Larson's work, as immortalized in the film Tick, Tick, Boom with Bradley Whitford's character, and Sondheim, in real life, did provide Larson with a lot of positive and constructive criticisms and a lot of faith and backing in his abilities. But by contrast, Peter Stone, the songwriter for the musical 1776, absolutely despised Superbia, and he thought that the idea that media makes people emotionally disconnected was ridiculous, to the point that he would shout down both Larson and supporters at the workshop when they would try to protest this. And really, it's a very funny, interesting microcosm of where Broadway was in the 1980s. It was at this real changing of the guard, BK.
Yeah, I know a bit about that time period, but not as much as I'd like to. But what I do know was that was a golden age, if I will say. It was the point where Broadway was becoming very, I guess, mainstream, for lack of a better word. It was getting this wilder renowned, but with that also comes a sense of staleness or sameness. It was very much prime time for something new in the scene. So I'm curious, Jack, how far off am I in that?
You're pretty much spot on in your assessment there. And it's really down to, in a lot of ways, the work of Andrew Lloyd Webber coming to Broadway, where you see a lot of this change. Because the 1980s is in large part considered to be an ambitious period on Broadway for an explosion of massive staging and massive theatricality, you know, big special effects, big production numbers, bigger budgets. And with the success of stuff like The Phantom of the Opera and Cats, it was hard to deny that tradition. But Broadway was also, much like Hollywood at the time, looking for bankable tentpoles to base itself around and to build itself off of. This is the era in which the jukebox musical becomes extremely popular. For those of you who aren't aware, a jukebox is a musical based around selected pre-written works by an established musician. Think Dreamgirls or Across the Universe are prominent examples of this. And really, all of these traditions for big staging and for well-known properties would culminate in 1987 around Les Miserables, when it debuted on Broadway and became the defining hit of the decade, popularizing and defining the pop opera era as it became to be known.
I did not realize the timelines on these, Jack. When you're spelling this out for me, I was kind of aware of the order in which these musicals kind of came to Broadway, but not the timeline in which they happened and the closeness in which they did. Because let me tell you, I have been fortunate enough to see a handful of Broadway plays, and Phantom of the Opera is very much a large set, a large production. There is a lot of moving parts and pieces into it, let alone the style of music and how different that is compared to the era before this time. So to find out that Les Mis is the musical that really like set the stage and can really be a good example of what Broadway was at the time is great context for me.
And it's a great example of what Broadway was at the time, but in a lot of ways, it was also kind of the last gasps of the older generation of composers who were still holding on to those pop and operatic bass writing standards. Meanwhile, the new generation was very interested in rock composition techniques, and they were starting to put more of that influence, sort of similar to what you saw early on in the 70s from Tim Rice on a show like Jesus Christ Superstar. You started seeing rock composition really come into vogue, but really the big force change is what these composers and these playwrights wanted to talk about underneath as their primary subtext. And on Broadway, an environment where the LGBTQ community is disproportionately represented and disproportionately visible, what the new generation needed to talk about was the AIDS crisis.
110%. And I'm so glad you brought us there, because it is very important to talk about this historical context here, with the LGBT community being one of the most prominent communities within theater and performance art. When you're living on the streets, around the block, in the corner, in your city, And the booming business of Broadway is having these multiple $1 million successes at this point, and you can't see yourself up there. You don't see your representation. It's such a disappointing thing to find out, let alone experience. And the LGBT community was going through so much at this time. The AIDS crisis is far worse than I think anyone understands in our current generation, Jack.
It's weird because we went through this COVID pandemic and still are going through this COVID pandemic where the disease has been highly visible and at the forefront of the conversation internationally. But with the AIDS crisis, it really started and promulgated and became a pandemic in the shadows. You know, the first official cases of what became known as AIDS were identified in 5 gay men in Los Angeles in 1981, but the virus likely existed among intravenous drug users in New York City as early as 1975, and New Yorkers were identified as dying from complications due to AIDS as early as 1980. So this was something that was in and around the United States in the late 70s and the early 80s, but it wasn't talked about. It was even defined at this time by the federal government as GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency. It was really thought of scientifically as a gay disease until in 1982, an effort from gay community leaders and the CDC would result in the virus being renamed as AIDS after they had to offer the government substantive proof that it does not only impact gay men.
It's wild to think about that. And I know we've had very similar things that have echoed in recent history, but to really understand what happened at the time and to really understand how AIDS was used as a primary force of bigotry and segregation, almost dehumanization, if we will, of that community. It was used as a weapon to justify hatred and mistreatment throughout the time and was very, very prominent. It was something you couldn't escape.
Part of the real tragedy of AIDS is that the government was a primary driver of bigotry and segregation of LGBTQ society during the 80s. Ronald Reagan did not mention AIDS by name until 1985. For the first term of his presidency, he completely ignored the issue publicly. The only real reaction from the government was a negative one, a discriminatory one, because in 1983, the U.S. Public Health Service would ban gay individuals from donating blood because of the fact that they were considered a high-risk population for AIDS. And while Reagan would eventually acknowledge the crisis, even if Nancy Reagan didn't, in 1987, Randy Shilts released the book And the Band Played On, which revealed to the public that the federal government's indifference to AIDS in that era was driven by evangelicals and conservatives viewing it as the quote-unquote gay disease and peddling that propaganda at the highest halls of U.S. power. And this is most ardently personified in terms of government discrimination in the Helms Amendments.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's directly referenced in the film, this context that is going on, the history that has been happening at this time when we're talking about Tick, Tick, Boom. We're talking about the life of Jonathan Larson and those that he loved and those were around him. And this was a conversation that he lived and breathed, at least in the ecosystem that he lived in, and was really starting to become aware of the conversation and to genuinely see how ridiculous it had become and how inaccurate it had become, and that there needed to be a chance to talk about it. When I was watching this, I will be honest, I wasn't aware of the Helms Amendments until I dived into this and kind of learned about it through the film.
It's very interesting to me that Larson's awareness of the issue kicks into high gear with the Helms Amendments. There is the work of Superbia before that where he really doesn't deal with the issues of AIDS and doesn't deal with LGBTQ issues at all in his work, to, after the Helms Amendments, going into them very ardently in his work. But I will say it's personal for me as well, because Helms is from North Carolina, and he is also, I think, interesting in terms of biology because he's the first recorded instance I've ever come across of a heap of horse manure gaining sentience and serving in public office. No, but anyway, so this mound of feces in 1987 goes to Ronald Reagan, outraged by a flyer promoting same-sex that is being distributed by the Gay Men's Health Crisis, one of the first groups to really spearhead public awareness of the AIDS crisis. And he lies to Reagan about these pamphlets depicting gay sex acts being publicly funded, even though these flyers were privately funded by independent donors of the organization. And so with the president's assent, Helms goes to Congress and, backed by the evangelical lobbying group, the Moral Majority, forwards the Helms Amendments to Congress, which prohibited the use of federal funding for any HIV/AIDS educational materials that would promote or encourage directly or indirectly homosexual activities. That was the phrasing that he put in the bill, and let's not make any bones about it. These amendments actively disrupted and harmed AIDS prevention efforts. These amendments killed people. We don't know what the body count is because it's hard to quantify deaths when something like that is written, but make no mistake about the evil implicit in that. It was an attempt to make gay people invisible and to have them die in silence from an epidemic illness.
Wow. Understanding how it was backed and how it got to the floor to be amendment gives another level of insight and honestly, like, what's the word? Just evil to it? I'm trying to figure out how to explain how I'm feeling finding out about that. But I'm very, very reaffirmed in understanding why this was the moment that impacted Jonathan Larson. I think it was something that was undeniable now that the government was not there to protect all people. And it's said and echoed in a lot of his music, especially in Tick Tick Boom, talking about why does it take an incident to start a revolution or to spark some sort of change. And I'm pretty sure that's what the amendments did it not, Jack?
The amendments really did have a carryover effect of being a spark that lit a fire that was already burning when it came to fighting back against the AIDS epidemic and against AIDS disinformation. For one, the resolution of the particular case of the Helms Amendments was that the CDC began rejecting almost all dissemination of men's health materials because they were afraid of these new amendments, and the Gay Men's Health Crisis successfully sued them over those offensiveness standards and got a lot of the Helms Amendments largely made toothless. But beyond that, the gay community was in a very grassroots way in the theater finding a way to connect to people and to humanize the AIDS struggle, in particular through shows throughout the 1980s about the crisis, like the collaborative work The AIDS Show, or Larry Kramer's play The Normal Heart. There was a real conscious effort by thespians, beyond just musical theater, BK, to actually get out and to support efforts to make AIDS education and AIDS awareness a big issue. When teenager Ryan White, a young kid in Indiana, contracted AIDS after a blood transfusion and responded to the bullying and abuse that he received because of that AIDS diagnosis, he launched a national campaign that would be embraced by people like Elton John, Michael Jackson, and Greg Louganis. And this would even cross over into the world of film in 1993, when the film Philadelphia would immortalize Jeffrey Bower's struggle when he was fired from his law firm and had to launch one of the most visible AIDS discrimination cases in history. So the fight back was really beginning in earnest during this period.
It was definitely at this point where I feel as if people were no longer just standing by, and it's where people were done being silenced. They no longer wanted to stand by and continue to let this go unchecked or unknown. This sort of camaraderie and support behind the cause really started to tick up in the 90s.
Just a shame that a lot of it had to come because of the weight of the tragedy of the epidemic and the way that, much like the standout Maryland basketball player Len Bias dying of a cocaine overdose, raising awareness of the dangers of cocaine in the 1980s, it would take the deaths of a number of notable luminaries to really start to sway a public opinion in large form and to make this crisis visible. There was Ricky Wilson, the guitarist from the B-52s. The band themselves being a gay icon. There was Gina Carano, considered widely to be the first ever supermodel, who was one of the first notable cases of a woman contracting and dying of AIDS. There was NASCAR racer Tim Richmond, who contracted AIDS through heterosexual sex and was one of the first visible cases of heterosexual transmission. But in the 80s, far and above, the biggest impact was Rock Hudson, not only coming out as gay when he admitted his diagnosis, but being this cultural figure who had been much beloved as an A-list celebrity in the 50s and 60s. It would be like The Rock saying today that he had a terminal illness. It was that kind of monumental presence that he had.
And I feel as if we kind of know that a little all too well when coming out with celebrities and terminal illnesses. I mean, the world was shook when Chadwick Boseman passed away from his illness. So to kind of put yourself in those emotions of a recent event and think about the level and intensity of the entire climate surrounding that disease in the time that it was happening and quite frankly rampant, it's kind of shocking and it shakes you to the core. It makes you become very emotional to find out how many people died because of misinformation, to your point, Jack. How many people had to lose their lives so young and so early from the lack of actual information and education on the matter. I mean, the issue of AIDS expanded outside of the LGBT community very, very quickly. Quite frankly, it originated in other realms. It's only that community that got the flag for it, that was focused on and was villainized for the disease. When AIDS and the HIV strand was rampant in drug users, it was a problem that affected these inner city people, these celebrities, those that rolled in those circles, and no one was talking about it. So having that breakthrough and finally having these incidents, as unfortunate as they are, really did shake the public consciousness on the matter. And I think really rattled Jonathan Larson to the core. I mean, it's pretty much the reason why he set out to kind of build out these stories and what will later be most known for.
And by the time he was putting down Superbia and picking up his next musical work in 1991, AIDS would have arguably its most visible month ever in November of 1991. First on November 7th, when LA Lakers legend Magic Johnson would announce his HIV diagnosis, and then over the next several years would play an enormous role in destigmatizing AIDS for the USA and eroding the moral majority's grip on AIDS policy. But then tragically later in the same month, on November 24th, 1991, Freddie Mercury, the frontman of Queen, would announce his AIDS diagnosis and die from the virus within 24 hours of the announcement. And so it's something that became undeniable when you had two luminaries of that stature being directly impacted by the crisis, and it led to monumental upswells in AIDS funding and in AIDS research that continue to this day. And though AIDS deaths finally, thankfully, peaked in 2004, around 2 million people per year, it's still a concurrent pandemic. 650,000 people a year, or 1,500 people a day, still die from complications due to AIDS. So it's something that's still ongoing. And to see Larson pick up this consciousness and awareness around this time and to take on that weight with his next work, Boho Days, and with his works that would follow, is really gratifying for me personally to see, knowing the way that AIDS finally became visible in this era.
And I'm glad that you brought up that it's still an issue to this day. I think that's partly why some of Jonathan Larson's music still resonates so hard, and why his musicals Tick Tick Boom and his musical Rent are staples of the human zeitgeist, as you like to say. They are prominent, important, and impactful. It's so impactful that Jonathan Larson literally decided to take on his message, his newfound awareness of the issue, and put on a solo rock monologue about the issue. Like, I can't imagine someone being so impacted from something to be like, hold on, let me go write an entirety of a musical about this situation. Let me let me get these things within my music and in my artistry as soon as possible.
And as far as I can tell, Boho Days is basically just the rough draft of Tick Tick Boom.
It is. Boho Days is really the original title of Jonathan Larson's one-man show. It's called a rock monologue. It's a form of theater that was brand new at the time. And really, it became the premise and the groundwork of Tick Tick Boom. It was a direct response to the failure of his first musical, Suburbia, and told a really very honest story of that journey and what it would cost to make Suburbia was too much. So he said, F that, I'm gonna make my new Boho Days, or what will be known as Tick Tick Boom, by myself. I'll pay for my band and I'm gonna do it just me, because making something from the ground up at that time, I mean, even now as an artist, it costs a lot to be able to get into it. And we talked earlier about what kind of sound system and what types of instruments and the level of equipment needed to perform a rock musical. And that was something that Jonathan Larson was very, very honed in on, was how he wanted to sound. His musicality was never a question. It was more of the storytelling that he learned to grow upon throughout his journey.
It made for a really interesting film, seeing this be the framework through which it's adapted, because we really kind of get two plays in one here. On one hand, we get the actual written play Tick Tick Boom about his experiences in Superbia, but rather than experiencing Superbia as a monologue, we get this nice little biopic framing visually that brings the audience in. It's kind of a Russian nesting doll of a film, which I appreciated about it because it allowed the musicality to shine through in the way that showed that Larson is always, even to his detriment, thinking about the music, thinking about bringing the concept to its realization. So that leads me to ask you, kind of nice, this week I get to take a bit of a backseat role and ask you this question. How do we actualize the musical Tick Tick Boom into the film Tick Tick Boom? Now, I understand that this wasn't even, when Jonathan Larson created the play, it wasn't even the final version of the play.
No, it wasn't at all, actually. The version of the play that is most widely known by people actually only happened post Jonathan Larson's untimely passing. It became a 3-person cast, fully adapted by David Auburn, who is an award-winning author. He wanted to reconfigure the source material and kind of restructure what would be a one-man monologue into a 3-actor musical, staying very true to kind of the workshop feel and aesthetic that the original material had, but adding layers and kind of adding characters and a little bit more of a kind of musical narrative to the story while still staying very true to the source material was made after his passing. So to see that transition and to see the evolution of the material come to life off Broadway at Jan Street Theater in 2001 was fascinating. The script and the score were reworked and streamlined, but there was a very prominent consciousness of trying to keep the original material at heart. I mean, Jonathan Larson is, I would say, idolized, but in the most humble and honest and wholesome way. There is something about his vulnerability in his work and in the music that he makes that I think any artist who tries to tackle his work has to be very conscious of. So when Auburn decided to rework it, it was widely received. He gave more of a sense of a plot progression and provided opportunities to incorporate previously unreleased music. The song Come to Your Senses, which is one of the main ballads of the film, which was originally written for Superbia.
It's a really interesting rework of the show, and I really did, again, enjoy seeing it as the framing device. But I have to say, with the greatest respect in the world to Jonathan Larson and to David Auburn, that still kind of sounds like a bit of a niche kind of off-Broadway show. You know, it seems like Larson still has the same problem he had in Superbia. It seems like he's written something that's great, but it's also very niche, very cult. So how does this very beloved but little-known show get into the hands of its producer, Julia O?
She ended up seeing Lin-Manuel Miranda star in the 2014 production, a New York City center, of Tick, Tick, a Boom as a part of the Encores tour, which was a concert series dedicated to performing rarely heard musicals. And after seeing Lin-Manuel perform, it just ticked with her. I had to say it, but it did. It was one of those things where it planted the seed, and it was only solidified when O reads an NYT article by Miranda about how Tick, Tick, Boom inspired him when he saw the off-Broadway production in 2001. He felt that it was extremely important for it to become a film, as well as O. And really, O thought that Miranda was literally the only director who would be able to do this film justice.
Amazing to consider, because Hamilton was yet to be a fully formed project in 2014. Lin-Manuel Miranda was a guy with a passion and with a big dream at this point. And so Julia O really seeing his ability to translate the material and his investment in the project and identifying that when it came time to adapt it. That's a really cool, kind of a special connection. It smells to me a bit like we've got another passion project on our hands.
Oh, it 100% was. It was a passion project for every single person involved with this film. And I can't attest it any more than that. I think that is what draws me to this film so much, is there was so much love and care and dedication brought into this. I mean, Miranda and Levinson, the screenwriter, and O all treated making this film as creating a musical, an original musical. They even workshopped it in secret as like a real theater musical would do. It's not just table readings. They did full workshops and really kind of dissected and reworked and relooked and picked apart so many different things from Jonathan Larson's work to kind of combine them and craft their own version of the material that tells the story of Tick, Tick, Boom that already exists, but also pays a tribute to Jonathan Larson's life as well. And I think that's where, for the film version of this, that kind of biopic feel comes in right there.
Yeah, it really does come across as a love story to the man as much as it does a tribute to his work. And it feels like the best way to convey how successful they were was that they got a full and total investment, it felt like, from Andrew Garfield, the guy that they got to play Jonathan Larson.
Oh, yeah. Andrew Garfield's involvement on this project is insane. Because, first of all, Mans was on Broadway, like outside of this, not musical theater, but plays.
So he was like, while he was working on this, he was on Broadway at the same time.
Just before. That's actually how Miranda found Garfield and saw him and knew that he was right for the role. I mean, Andrew Garfield just finished his run in the Broadway revival of Angels in America the day before all of this is happening. And Miranda is smitten. When I tell you, just blown away. There's so many awesome BTS videos surrounding the development of this project. And you can just tell that Miranda was overwhelmed by Garfield's presence, his stage presence, and overwhelmed by the energy, the passion, and the dedication that he put into his craft. Miranda has said that Garfield was the only person to fit for the role. Now, that sounded more like the stars aligning when now that's not one, but two people who are quote unquote the only person for the job. Starting to sound like there's some other powers at work here.
And it sounds like this film really does benefit from the fact that it had such a significant investment from its creatives. But it also comes across as a very honest portrait of its subject. Uniquely human and grounded. Was that a conscious effort?
Oh, 110%. They actually were able to receive Larson's sister's blessing. She was entirely invested in the project with the hands that had it in there. And it was a conscious decision to not let any adaptations of Larson's work happen unless the right creatives were behind it. And when you start having Miranda and Levinson and O doing extensive research from his background and his life, you start to know that that is why these people were doing the project. And giving that blessing was so easy for Larson's sister. I mean, she discouraged the team from sanitizing Larson's image, telling them to get all the warts, get all of that good stuff. They wanted him to be real. They wanted to see all sides of him. They were going through home videos that were provided. They were going through interviews and having interviews from people who were giving all sides of Larson, telling the good, telling the bad, taking all of that information to be able to really accurately depict Larson in his character, let alone him in his environment there. Every little bit of attention to detail was intentional by the creative behind it. And to know that all of this project was backed by his sister just is icing on the top for me.
It's wonderful to know that his family wanted to see him earnestly portrayed like that. But it sounds like this research, just from my little poking around, it sounded like this went even deeper than I even imagined. Like, did the filmmakers or did they not go to the Library of Congress to research this film?
Yes. When I tell you, Jack, I could not believe what I was finding out when I read that. It did, in fact, go to the Library of Congress to access the Jonathan Larson papers for original scripts, demo tapes for Superbia, 3090, Boho Days, and Tick Tick Boom. Scenes from these scripts were used to create new scenes for the film. Certain moments from that are in the original scripts. Rimmer, a character, was a code name for Sondheim, and it was actually him. So they would have not known that nickname was him if they had not found these papers and learned the truth behind the story and in the creation of these plays. So
okay, can I just stop for a second? That's wild that they had to like go into the archives and decode this secret name to discover Sondheim.
yes, well, if you take a start at the film, it says stuff as this is the story of his life, but everything is true except for the things that he made up. And you kind of start to wonder, well, is that true? There's this friend who's giving him all this praise, who's very well known. Oh, could it be him? And finding out that it actually indeed was Sondheim and they had that relationship and rapport really changed the game for them. I just think it's kind of crazy it took the Library of Congress for that.
That's cool, though. They were going into so much detail to build this project, but I'm guessing if they're doing that and they're dredging up all of these demos and all of these reels, it sounds to me like they must have gone through a heck of a process building this soundtrack.
Oh my gosh. The soundtrack was, I would say, the bulk of the work. I mean, they did all of the music first and the pre-recordings before they even started blocking or getting people in stage, let alone talking about how difficult that was during the pandemic. But you can't have a musical without the musical. And siphoning through all of Jonathan Larson's work is an endeavor in itself. And to see the work that Miranda put in with the team, with Levinson, to really craft a new story and a new experience and kind of find the songs that would make sense or wouldn't make sense was a big process. I mean, they really did kind of dissect this thing, not just cutting things, but adding new things too.
Interesting. So we sort of saw the musical Tick Tick Boom, but we sort of didn't see the musical Tick Tick Boom. So what extra did we get? What little pieces does the audience of this film get that are special or unique? I'm curious.
There were actually 3 songs that were in the original rock monologue, but not in the Auburn adaptation with the 3-person cast. Those songs were Boho Days, the a cappella number, Play Game, and Swimming. Swimming had been cut by Larson himself after the show and had not been heard by the public in 30 years until this film.
That is a long, long time to be buried.
Yes, it really is. But some of these original songs really paved way to tell a great story. And Boho Days and Swimming are really great lenses into Larson as a character and not just the song itself. I mean, Boho Days is showing how Larson enjoys being in the moment and how he is with his friends and his musicality without a band behind him. Swimming is really a turning point for Larson in being able to write that song for Superbia at that last moment and really recognizing the talent within himself and understanding what he needs to do to be inspired and gain that inspiration to be creative and finish his project. So these songs were very, very specific in why they were chosen and where they were placed within the film.
Yeah, these numbers come across as very authentic, and I know that you mentioned that a lot of this was lip synced or pre recorded just by virtue of necessity. I mean, it is a Hollywood production. You need to get the best sound and the best audio quality possible. But apparently, there were two big exceptions on this film, were there not?
Oh, yeah. There were two big exceptions, and both of them make complete sense. And honestly, I'm moved, and it shows the dedication that Andrew Garfield had. So there are two songs that were actually sung live on set. And that was a very difficult ask during the height of the pandemic. Those two songs were the ballad from Garfield, Why. He felt that the emotions in the pre recorded playback track were insufficient. So he sang the song live at the Decorate Theater. I don't know if I said that right, Jack. And then, as well as I said, the a cappella song earlier, Boho Days, was another one of those musical numbers filmed with live singing, and all of the actors in that scene had to quarantine for 14 days in order to film it because of the COVID protocols.
That's a heck of an effort to go to. I mean, it's real dedication to this film. But it seems like a piece of material that really emboldens and sort of builds up that faith in the creatives around it, because it has some really striking messages to convey to his audience. I mean, maybe we just resonate with it the way that we do because it discusses as it's framing the life of an artist, particularly an artist in New York City, particularly a starving artist in New York City. And I don't need to tell you, BK, because you've lived it the way that I've lived it, what that feels like and what that daily structure is like. But I think that really did speak to me watching it, because it is a very honest depiction of what that is actually like.
110%. It is a raw look at the life of an artist and the struggle of putting your heart and soul into what you make for other people to judge and support. It's very difficult when you think about trying to be an artist. A lot of people are flippant with that as a title or role, and that kind of theme is even discussed often throughout the film with what are we doing with our time, and how long are we going to do this till we give up, and doesn't matter, doesn't mean something. How are we not going to take it personal when we're told no 1,000 times, when we're told to do it again and again and again? This theme tackles that story in so many ways. And I think the one that hits the most is the fact that it's telling the story of Jonathan Larson's struggle of Superbia. It is so meta, Jack.
It's meta, but it's meta in service of telling a story that I think is really about, I would say, anxiety and perseverance. I mean, the thing that comes off the page to me and that really jumps out to me is that it's a very earnest depiction of the constant cycle of failure in artistry. And that's something that everybody who has tried to create anything goes through. And what I mean by failure in artistry, it isn't just that, oh, my script didn't get picked up, oh, my show didn't get made. It's the inability to write 2 words on a page that you've been looking at for 12 hours. It is the fact that you'll write a draft of something and then you will say to yourself, as the artist who wrote it, this is one of the worst things that anybody has ever written and no one's ever going to love it. It's that unique struggle and insecurity that everybody who creates art has to overcome and deal with. And a lot of what Larson's struggle in the film is, and in his life is, it's about surmounting having that fear in the first place and being okay with what every artist has to reconcile with, which is embracing failure.
Embracing failure. That's such a good way to put it. I mean, that really is maybe the moral of the story in a sense. And even in the film, failure is depicted differently than you would think. If that makes any sense, Jack, hear me out. Larson in the film, Jonathan Larson, he didn't really fail. I mean, his performance was a success, but it wasn't a financial success. There are levels to success when it comes to business or artistry, and kind of tackling that very deep and leveled conversation of what it means to be successful, the anxieties of that, and what it means to fail. I think this film just does a great look at it. I mean, he did fail. His first musical, Suburbia, did not go anywhere. It was a failure. And he turned that failure into Tick, Tick, Boom, which in turn was a failure in a sense. He didn't really make money from it. It didn't really surmount to something. But let me tell you, that failure turned into one of the greatest musicals of all time. So to see that perseverance and to see that that did not stop him and pushed him through, that failure was turned into rocks of gold and dissected into elements that worked. And sorry, I'm getting emotional by it because I'm moved by it. I think that is the thing that I connect with Larson with so much, is he really did take all of his no's and turned them into one fat yes, Jack.
I think that story of perseverance is really important, but I think as the film makes very clear, a lot of that perseverance comes from the fact that it's very plain that he is well grounded by the love in his life and the friendship in his life. And the movie, I thought, in a really cool, subtle, kind of subversive way, discusses love as broader and more non-traditional in the way that the LGBTQ community, or even the ethically non-monogamous community, tends to look at love as expansive rather than restrictive. I mean, yes, you do see this restrictive back and forth between Jonathan and Susan as they grapple over their relationship, but the reason he can survive the breakup, the reason that he can deal with the favor of Suburbia, is because he has such strong platonic love in his life. He has such strong fraternal love in his life. He has the love of mentorship in his life. And so there is this real understanding that he is able to persevere because the strength around Jonathan Larson gives him that strength and that ability to overcome. And it is his embrace of non-traditional love that really guides his path.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because really a thing that is prominent in the LGBT community is this idea or the notion of found family. And I really, really love that. It's the idea that sometimes your blood might not be your family, or sometimes those who are around you become as close as family. And as a New Yorker, I can attest, when you are on the block, when you live there, it is such a New York thing to find your found family and to have the camaraderie in the spaces you're in. And that's what Larson did. He brought people together at a community level, but also did have those very deep and intimate relationships with his friends, and that deep sense of platonic love, as you said, Jack, that I think fueled him through all of this. Without this support, I don't know if he really would have gotten far. And the reality of Jonathan Larson's romantic story is that he really did have an on and off relationship with Susan, but they didn't really break up in real life as a hard cutoff, just being on and off. And actually, at the time of his passing, he was still with that same woman. So it's kind of interesting to see that even a relationship that isn't steady or might have been fickle, the love was strong and the love was there at a romantic level too. I mean, talking about love and friendship is very hard and often is overly romanticized. And I think with Larson's music, he really tackles those thoughts about dealing with love, dealing with friendship, the consequences of those relationships and the circumstances that happen around them, and really dissects them within his music and throughout this film adaptation even.
And I also think that the film is really good about showing that the love in his life isn't a one-way street, and he has to overcome his sort of selfish demeanor of looking at it as a one-way street while he focuses on Superbia to actually embrace the life that is happening around him. He starts having a falling out with Susan because he's too focused on what others can do for him and how they can support him. He misses out on Michael's HIV diagnosis because he's too focused on his show. And you see that there's a real point at which he has to learn that the consequences of his actions are a genuine opportunity cost of trading off living and experiencing life and building off of his lived experiences to create his pet show. And I think, honestly, BK, that's probably why he's so able to embrace the failure of Superbia and move on, is because he's tried to give up everything to make this one thing work. And if that approach doesn't work, the only thing you have left to do is to re-embrace real life.
That's so beautifully put. I think you're really on to something. The notion of embracing life, no day but today, to quote lyrics from him, it's really a prominent theme throughout a lot of his works. He is someone who relishes in the moment and the life that he has and those that are around him, and really pays more attention to it, is self-aware at the need to focus in embracing the life, because without it, you'll live a life of fear, and he can't continue to live that life. He's kind of learned what living life in fear does to him. And that concept right there hits so hard when you think about it within the context of the AIDS crisis at the time.
Absolutely, but it is still something, and I picked this up a little bit in the reception of Tick, Tick, Boom as well. It is still something that is written from the lens of a straight male who did not contract the disease. And I guess there's an argument to be made, although I kind of don't ascribe to it, that some do consider the portrayal of AIDS in Tick, Tick, Boom to be a little bit inadequate. Now, I have my response to this, but I'm curious to hear yours.
I think that it does a decent job coming from his perspective. I think Tick, Tick, Boom was never meant to be from someone else's perspective, and I understand that with it involving this context of the time and it being a very prominent element to the storytelling, being conscious of the portrayal of the AIDS crisis has to be important. But this is the story of Jonathan Larson and his interaction and engagement with that. And I think it does a pretty honest tale of that experience.
You came back to the exact word that I was going to use. Why do we share a brain, BK?
Are we synergizing? I need to hear. Tell me.
Well, I was going to say, is the one thing I keep coming back to, and the word I keep coming back to this film is honest and earnest. And I think that means showing Jonathan Larson's flaws and all. And I argued earlier that I don't think Superbia is that hip or wise to the AIDS crisis as a story or as a play. And it really seems like this film does a good job of expressing that despite the fact that Larson is living in this world where the AIDS crisis is present and you do have to be mindful of it, he's not truly engaged with it until he has to be woken up, quite literally, by his friend laying it out for him that the Jesse Helms amendments don't allow him to live freely the life that he would like to choose. He has to be told by his best friend that he has HIV in order for it to become real to him. And while there is something to be said for the negatives of not being aware of things until they impact you, it's honest about the artist that it's portraying, and I think that that's pretty important, because half of the conversation around the AIDS crisis, at least, has always been the visibility of the struggle of those with HIV and AIDS to be seen, to be heard, and to be treated as people. And I think seeing someone have to be woken up to that thought and woken up to that idea is an important act to depict on film.
I have to agree with you. I think sometimes for film, it's worth showing that lens and showing that ignorance in a sense. You said it very well, that it is a problem. It is a conversation when awareness isn't known unless it directly impacts you. But I think the film does show that him not knowing was a flaw, that it was not something to be proud of. It did not glamorize him finding out, but it really did show that this can happen to people, and this is how it affects others. I've never felt so connected to a friendship in any other work. I'm trying to really think of it. I might, 50 episodes down the line, double back on this, but as of now in 2022, I really really enjoy the bromance that is shown. And I say it that way because it's a deep and intimate connection between Jonathan and his best friend who has the disease, who has AIDS. It's such an intimate moment of seeing the failure to be a friend, seeing the growth, having an entire song of processing how you failed at being a friend, and really shows at least an attempt at growth. And I think seeing that depicted is also important, right? Like, I think that is something.
And I think ultimately that's going to be how I reflect on this film looking back at it, is just that honest, earnest quality that it has about itself is something that is really important to convey when you are telling a story that is this raw. And it's not honest in an exploitative way. You know, it doesn't exploit the tragedy of the AIDS crisis. It doesn't exploit the weak or raw moments in Jonathan Larson's life. Instead, it takes things as they are and allows the film to construct a world in which its subject and the people around him are functioning in a realized, extremely eerily accurate representation of the society that they're depicting. And I think that above all, the film is great because it shows that there is a joy to be found in struggle, no matter how hard that struggle is. And there is an act of liberation and of rebellion in being defiant in the face of struggle. Whether or not you are struggling to get a musical out there, and it's on that level of being that simple, or if you are struggling with something of the gravity of the AIDS crisis, that perseverance and keeping joy in that perseverance is so crucial. And I appreciate this film for extending that message to its audience.
God, that was beautiful. See, you say things so much better than me sometimes, Jack. You really do, and I love it. It's like you are able to, like, adequately convey what my emotional little brain thinks, because when it comes to Jonathan Larson's work and his music, it just connects to me on such a deep level. His musicality that has been inspired by Sondheim and really kind of broke out and became something different, something new age, something unique that constantly tackles the questions about giving into love or living in fear, seizing the day. Some of the lyrics from some of the best songs in this, is the one that hits hard is louder than words, which is a very famous idiom. Action speaking louder than words. Cages or wings, which do you prefer? It's there. It's in every song. Fear or love, baby, don't say the answer. I have to kind of bring them up because that is what is the message that stays with you and resonates with you. And I can attest that anyone who really gives a chance for Larson's work to enter your heart and really sit with you, you will be moved by this. And this film is a testament to that notion, with how much dedication and thought that was put into every element of this show. And when I tell y'all, listen to me, the cameos and the references to all of his work run so deep. Every creative involved in this project wanted to bring elements of Larson at any moment they can, to the point where there are people who directed the Broadway production, people that directly worked with him. The director himself makes a cameo. Performers in previous performances of Tick, Tick, Boom, of Rent. It goes on and on and on, to the point where even Julie Larson, Larson's sister, is in the audience there at the final scene, where they are in the very theater that he originally performed Boho Days, Tick, Tick, Boom. They actually got access to that theater. All of the performances, where there are 3 of them on the stage, is filmed in the Off-Broad Playhouse Second Stage Theater in New York. So when I tell you that the people who made this film cared and were deeply impacted by Larson's perseverance and messages that he tried to convey through his music. So that is really why I wanted to share this with everyone listening, and especially with you, Jack. I think we talk about a lot of things very intimately on the show, and we bring up films that kind of hit us at different levels. And this is one that I could not stop thinking about once I saw it.
I would call it a success, considering you showed it to somebody who is highly skeptical of a lot of modern filmmaking, and I was very, very pleased by what we saw today.
It is a very, very different take on modern filmmaking. It has done something unique for the musical theater genre, especially when it's a film adaptation. And I really think that this film is going to bring us into another generation of great musical theater movies. I mean, we've already started to see it a little bit in the Heights and West Side Story and Hamilton. The world is getting bigger now. So I am so excited to kind of be able to challenge you and throw curveballs like this one at you, and to hear that you liked it, Jack. Oh,
I did like it. I indulged you with this new modern musical movement, but in turn, BK, next week you're going to have to indulge me something fierce, because I am taking our podcast older than it has ever been before.
Wait, how old? You didn't tell me it was that old. Hold on.
Yeah, we're going from 2021, folks, to 1941.
You didn't tell me you was that old, Jack.
Oh, listen, though, there is a method to my madness, because I know you love yourself a film noir, BK. I've established that in the first season.
You have? Wait, so are we watching an actual noir?
We're not just watching a noir, we're watching the noir, because it is time for us to watch John Huston's landmark film, The Maltese Falcon, starring Humphrey Bogart himself.
The Maltese Birdie Boo? What the? Are you making me watch a noir on birds? What's going on here?
I'm making you watch a noir that is from, once again, the pulp tradition. This seems to be a bit in my wheelhouse, but it is considered to be like the definitive noir film, one of the best movie mysteries in the first half century of filmmaking. It's just I don't want to spoil too much for you, but it is a shockingly modern film in its pacing and in its drama and in the way it plays out. It's something that would not, as a mystery, be out of place to this day. But it is an older film, and it is my opportunity to bring a tried and true OG classic to the podcast. So I am ready to go back in time and bring you the noir of noirs.
Ooh, I'm excited. I'm actually really excited. I know I'm not the best with the oldies and the black and white films, but I'm very interested, and I know my grandfather has talked a lot about this Bogart guy, so I can't wait to learn more about it. But I think we're going to have to stop for today. I'm so sad because I wanted to just geek out about all the references and cameos, Jack. Why do we have to end? Can't we just talk about Jonathan Larson for the next 2 more hours?
We could have watched Rent, but no, you wanted to put that in the later season.
No, don't blame me for it, but you're right. We actually have tons of content coming out, and we have a lot of plans coming in to the new year here with Revenge of the Film Nerds coming in 2023. Got lots of watch parties going on if you want to get in on those, or if you want to talk to us and get us in some suggestions as we're building out our future schedules coming into the new year. You can always check us out on Twitter at RFN_podcast or at Instagram at Revenge of the Film Nerds. We are there. We want to hear from you, want to know all the things. And if I've got any other fun facts about Tick Tick Boom or Larson, you already know that that's where we're going to be dropping that information there on our Twitter. So we hope to see you around. Be sure to check us out and follow there, because we're going to be coming back next week with an actual classic. I know I'm excited, and I hope you are too.
100%. But I think it is time to go. So from the Film Nerds, please take care. Have a good one.
We'll see you around.